Hello again, Dan Alasso here with Making History. And today, as I've been getting deeper into thinking about the Enlightenment and the first chapters of the Graeber-Wengrow book, I was reminded of some thoughts I had about the other end of the Enlightenment and a crazy book that I found called Reading Becomes a Necessity of Life, which I actually wrote my final paper in my graduate historiography class on. And this was an odd book for me to choose. Actually, I remember that when I told the two instructors that I was going to choose this book, the American historian, Heather Cox Richardson, said, "Ooh, do you really want to talk about him and that?" She apparently didn't have a very high opinion of William Gilmore Leaney. But I persisted and I wrote a paper on intellectual history in general and how this book, Reading Becomes a Necessity of Life, makes a contribution to changing intellectual history. And I got an A on the paper. The thing that interested me about intellectual history was what Thomas L. Haskell summarized in an article that I read as one of its main problems. Political history, he said, is about the nation, economic history is about the economy, but intellectual history is not about anything in quite this sense. The result has been much talk about zeitgeists, climates of opinion, and minds, which are holistic fictions, he continued, that remain useful only until familiarity breeds the usual contempt. One of the problems, of course, with intellectual history is that too often it becomes the history of intellectuals. And that's why I was reminded of it in the context of this book club where we're reading the Graeber-Wengrow book, The Dawn of Everything. And so I want to tell you a little bit about what William Gilmore Leaney found out about the reading habits of early Americans, because I think his findings were surprising and kind of interesting. Now, this book is a lot of things, and it isn't really laid out that well, but Gilmore did find out some very interesting things about this region that he studied around the town of Windsor, Vermont, which in its day was the largest town in Vermont. And so what he did was very extensively looked at the estate inventories of Windsor families. And basically, an estate inventory is what it sounds like. It's an inventory attached to a last will and testament. You can find them in the courthouses of most county seats throughout New England. And of course, they go all the way back to the beginning of white habitation of the region. And so Gilmore ran around and created a database of estate inventories, and especially of the books that he found in them. And what he found was that most American families in the period that he studied, which was about 1787 to about 1836, had libraries. And he found that this Windsor, Vermont district had 396 households that had a family library. From 1787 to 1796, 75% of households in the Windsor district had a library with an average of 7.5 books. From 1807 to 1816, he found 65% of Windsor families had a library with an average of about 10 books each. And then from 1827 to 1836, about 60% of families in the Windsor, Vermont area had libraries. And by that time, these libraries had grown to about 45 books each on the average. Now, obviously, the distribution of these books was spread rather widely. There are about 5,600 books in total that Gilmore found in estate inventories, and 64% of households had libraries of 1 to 5 books. 19% of households had from 6 to 14 books. 14% of households had from 15 to 99 books, and about 2% of households in this whole district that included not only the town of Windsor, but also the rural area around it, had over 100 books. And as I said, the total was 5,630 books, which were made up actually of over 2,500 distinct titles. And of all of these titles, less than 400 of them were religious texts, that is, Bibles or books of Psalms or hymnals, while over 1,700 were secular texts, school books, geographies, law books, literature, medicine, general knowledge, history, philosophy, that type of thing. And then there's also a category of sort of undefined titles. Of these 5,600 books, about 39% of them were in the libraries of professionals, doctors, lawyers, ministers. About 21% of them were in the libraries of what Gilmore called gentlemen farmers. 26% were in merchant or manufacturer or skilled artisan libraries. And then 15% of all of the books were in the libraries of yeoman or tenant farmers. And I think that that is really kind of interesting. So it's unfortunate that this book, Reading Becomes a Necessity of Life, isn't better known. But that is, I have to admit, probably because of its chaotic, uncoordinated, and repetitious organization of the information in it. Gilmore focused first on what he called the material and cultural foundations of rural life. He divided the ongoing commercialization of the Upper Connecticut River Valley over these decades into several distinct stages. And then this segmentation kind of allowed him to trace changes over time as commercial participation expanded from towns along the banks of the Connecticut River into the backcountry. Gilmore then traced the development of communication systems that allowed books and periodicals that were produced and accumulated in local centers, like the towns of Windsor and Chester, Vermont, to circulate into more remote villages and then ultimately all the way to isolated farmsteads. So along with the meeting house service, Gilmore said, the town meeting, the school session, and the multi-purpose general store, the bookstore was one of the most consequential social institutions in rural New England. Windsor, the center of Gilmore's study, was linked, he said, by major roads and the Connecticut River to 6 other permanent print centers at Brattleboro, Keene, New Hampshire, Walpole, Woodstock, Hanover, and Haverhill. Gilmore claimed that New Englanders were much less isolated than most historians have believed them to have been. And my own later research on the Yankee peddlers of Ashfield, I think, corroborates this claim. 2/3 of the Upper Connecticut River Valley families listed books in their estate inventories. And Gilmore found that nearly 75% of all reading matter throughout the 1820s consisted of British and, to a lesser extent, European works. So when he's describing the Upper Connecticut River Valley, Gilmore says that it's important to understand the extreme rurality of America among North Atlantic nations through 1830. Compared to the Netherlands and Great Britain, where 30% and 21%, respectively, of the people lived in cities, by 1800, the United States ranked just above Russia, with an urban population of less than 4%. For many historians, it has come as a revelation that sophisticated knowledge of the self and the world was possible outside the Republic of Letters, Gilmore said. But by 1800, nearly 2/3 of all Windsor district families retained a family library past the death of the household head. Perhaps even more surprising for traditionalists, Gilmore found that by 1810, the balance of reading material had already shifted from sacred to secular content. Print centers were an important feature in these central towns. Their activities included production of weekly newspapers, printing of original books, acquiring additional domestic titles from other printers or from wholesalers, and then reprinting foreign titles, which were not yet covered by international copyright laws. The small bookstore at Walpole, New Hampshire, for example, just across the Connecticut River, printed a local newspaper and in 1808 carried 31,280 volumes of nearly 1,500 titles. Fewer than a sixth were printed in the Upper Valley, Gilmore reported. The vast majority were shipped in from 23 other nodes in a long-distance supply network, including about 50 different works printed in Europe. With a population of fewer than 2,000 residents, Walpole's heavy consumption of books easily complicates simplistic assumptions regarding the intellectual abilities and interests of rural New Englanders. Now, the major flaws of this book are Gilmore's organization of his data and the very repetitive nature of his narrative. Gilmore's analysis hinges on the construction of these lists and of enumerated factors of change, which he uses kind of sporadically and kind of inconsistently throughout the text. So the reader is given a great deal of data in each of these lists and tables, but oftentimes really has no idea of how each family type lived in each habitat. To make matters worse, the text jumps from point to point almost at random and frequently reiterates previous points using slightly different data in a later section. A very, very highly motivated reader can piece together the information, but this doesn't excuse the poor construction of the text, which should have been addressed by the author, or at least by the editor. Finally, the influence of British and European thought on rural New Englanders is a question that Gilmore raised several times, but failed to really conclusively answer. By 1800, he said, 2/3 of all law books, 4/5 of all medical works, and 7/10 of all works in modern literature in his estate lists were by British authors. Anglo-American intellectual dialogue dominated the life of the mind into the 1820s, Gilmore suggested, without really explaining and specifying how this dialogue changed the development of popular culture in the region during that time. Even hill country residents, he said, were avid readers, and some of them fed on opposition to many of the new forms of material and cultural life in the New Republic through the books that found their way into the region. The form that this opposition took and its consequences for New England society at the dawn of the commercial industrial era was a question that Gilmore had actually intended to take up in a subsequent volume that was to be titled The Republic of Knowledge, which he was unfortunately unable to complete before his unexpected death in 1999. Reading Becomes a Necessity of Life received several positive reviews, but the book was generally considered, even by people who appreciated it, as having been severely compromised by Gilmore's poor presentation of his argument. In spite of his judgment that Reading Becomes a Necessity of Life is a, quote, cranky and almost indecipherable book, historian Paul Johnson told readers of the Journal of American History that the book was a solid accomplishment, the first map of reading in which the contents of family libraries document aspects of the democratization of mind in the early republic in unprecedentedly direct ways. So I think it's really unfortunate that this book didn't get a wider readership, that some editor didn't really take Gilmore to task and force him to clean it up a little bit. Among the data that a reader might miss at the end of the book in the appendices is a really long list of the titles in these estate inventories. And it goes on for page after page after page. It includes Ethan Allen's A Narrative of Colonel Ethan Allen's Captivity, which was printed in Walpole in 1807, and Reason, the Only Oracle of Man, or A Compendious System of Natural Religion, which was printed in Bennington in 1784. William Buchan's Domestic Medicine, or a treatise on the prevention and cure of diseases by regimen and simple medicines with an appendix for the use of private practitioners, which was printed in Fairhaven, Vermont in 1798. The Poetical Works of John Dryden with the life of the author in 2 volumes, printed in London in 1798. Benjamin Franklin's The Way of Wealth, printed in Worcester, Mass., probably by Isaiah Thomas in 1790. Washington Irving's The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, Gentleman, in 7 parts, printed in New York between 1819 and 1820. John Locke's Essay on Human Understanding, printed in London in 1690. James Lyon's The Scourge of Aristocracy and Repository of Important Political Truths, printed in Fairhaven, Vermont, between 1803 and 1808. John Milton's Poetical Works in 2 volumes, printed in Springfield, Massachusetts in 1794. Alexander Pope's Essay on Man, printed in Concord, New Hampshire in 1817. Sir Walter Scott's The Lady of the Lake, a poem in 6 cantos, printed in Montpelier, Vermont in 1813. Noah Webster's American Spelling Book, printed in Bennington, Vermont in 1794. And, of course, Mason Weems' Life of George Washington, printed in Philadelphia in 1819. And John Wesley's Primitive Physic, or An Easy and Natural Method of Curing Most Diseases, printed in New York in 1818. So again, I'm very interested in the way that these ideas of the Enlightenment, which we're beginning to see the beginnings of in the book club, find their way into cultural thought, first back in the old world and then later in the new world. And I'll probably have more to say about that as time goes on. But in any case, I hope people found that a little bit interesting. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again next time.